Hi everyone, welcome back. I'd like to share with you an idea that I heard from the late, great Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. May his memory be a blessing for all of us. Rabbi Sacks was an incredible person. He was a Torah scholar par excellence. He was a philosopher. He was a man of all letters. You name it, he knew it. He had an incredible memory, an incredible power of hasbara, of explaining things to all different types of audiences, whether they were college students, adults, religious groups, non-religious groups on the BBC or on television, mediums, on even to non-Jewish groups, whatever it may be. Jonathan Sacks was held in very, very high esteem to everyone. He was a member of the House of Lords in England. He was a former chief rabbi of England. Anyways, I heard this thing from him, and it's really very, very beautiful. If you want to take a look at it further and go into greater depth, you can take a look at him on YouTube on Hanukkah, dealing with Hanukkah. So Rabbi Sacks says that there's a story of Hanukkah that not too many people are familiar with. First of all, where do we know about Hanukkah from? What are the sources for Hanukkah? There are actually, he points out two, but there are actually three sources for Hanukkah. The two that he points out are a book that is not that well known. It's called Megillus Tainus, the book, literally the book of fast days. And he also points out the Apocrypha, which I'll talk about in a moment. There's a third source, and that source is the Talmud, the Gemara in Shabbos, which also describes to us about Hanukkah and how to observe Hanukkah. So let's talk about the second one I mentioned. First of all, the book, the Apocrypha. What is the Apocrypha exactly? There are several books of the Apocrypha. And the Apocrypha were writings that the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, the men of the Great Assembly, chose for various reasons not to include in the Bible. When they sat down to figure out which books are authentic books, which books should be held in very high esteem as biblical texts, the Apocrypha was not included in them. The Catholic Church, however, does include the Apocrypha in their Bible, but we don't. We don't. But nevertheless, the Apocrypha is significant. Jewish historians and rabbis refer to it. The Rebbe has referred to the Apocrypha from time to time. There are various books in the Apocrypha, the Book of Judith, and among them, there are two books called the Books of Maccabees. The Book of Maccabees, Maccabee 1 and Maccabee 2. And what exactly, we'll talk about exactly why these books were not included in the Bible. So the Book of Maccabees essentially tells the story of the war against the Greeks. It does not mention anything about oil, about finding oil, or oil lasting for 8 days, or whatever it may be. It simply discusses the war with the Greeks and how the Jewish people were vastly outnumbered by the Greek Syrians, and the story of how the rabbis are very nervous to start talking about the Second Temple. They were very worried about what he was going to be and how he was going to let them act and things like that. Well, he said to them that he has great respect for the Jewish religion. Some people even believe that he possibly converted to Judaism in the latter years. And he had a lot of respect for the Jewish religion and allowed them to practice as they are all familiar to practice. And this was good and fine. And after he passed away, the Greek Empire began its great decline, and until finally it was in its death throes, literally in its death throes, and over several leaders of the Greeks, together with the Syrians, the Seleucids, they were called, they came about and they said that we're not allowing the Jewish people to practice anymore. Enough is enough. The Jews need to Hellenize, they need to adopt the Greek religion, the Greek culture, the Greek games, the Greek language, and all kinds of things like that, or else they would be severely punished and even killed. So most Jews went along with it, and it continued, and it got worse and worse until finally they came to the wicked King Antiochus Epiphanes that we know about in the story. And this Antiochus forced the Jews to accept the Greek ways. The majority of the Jews went along with it. They were happy to do it. They felt that the Greek ways was the wave of the future. Little did they know that it was the end of the Greek regime, and it was going to be very soon, within 100 years or so, the Romans were to ascend. But nevertheless, most of the Jews became Hellenized. However, a small group of Jews resisted, and they made war, and they fought back. The war began in the town of Modin, which is just outside Jerusalem. You know Modin today. Many Jews live in Modin. It's a very popular place for people to live. It's about 45 minutes from Jerusalem. And in Modin, actually, the majority of the Jews, the majority population was Jewish. The Greeks were actually a minority. So for the Jews to rebel against the Greeks was no big deal, because they were the majority anyways, and the Greeks were weaker and a much smaller number. So the Jews rebelled, and they refused to worship the Greek gods, and the Greeks persecuted them and killed many of them, and a war began. We know that the war lasted for 3 years, and it was a very hard-fought war in which many people died, including the leader of the Jews, Matisyahu, the Hashmonaim leader, who was a high priest, and his sons, of which many of you know, Eliezer and Yehuda, etc., and there were others, and many of them died. But they miraculously won the war after 3 years, and they rededicated the Holy Temple. And that's a story. That's a story that is found in the Apocrypha. The truth is that nothing is mentioned about any oil. Nothing at all. So that's an incredible thing. The interesting thing was also that this war actually continued for about another 100 years. And it was very hard fought. And this war lasted for 100 years. However, the temple was won over, was conquered back, and rededicated after 3 years of this war. So that's what the Apocrypha, that's what the Book of Maccabees says. Nothing about any oil at all, because in those days it really wasn't important. The important thing was the war. They fought a war. If you were to fight a war and win the war and find some oil and light the oil, what do you think you would elevate as in importance? Obviously, it would be the war. The great battle was won. Many people died, and it was a tremendous victory. So in the Book of Maccabees, that victory is hailed as the great accomplishment and indeed the great miracle of Hanukkah. And for many years, it became simply observed as a remembrance of this tremendous war. Interestingly, there was never anything written about it, except later the Book of Maccabees. You would think that after a tremendous victory, a miraculous victory like this, a book of the Bible would be written about it, as it was in the story of Purim. In Purim, they won a war. It was also a tremendous war, and many people died in the war. It was a very, very hard-fought war against the Persians, and the Jews won the war, and there were many miracles associated with it, with the destruction of Haman and his children. We'll be observing Purim in a couple months. And after the incredible war and all the events of Purim were known, Esther and Mordechai wrote a book called Megillas Esther. And that book of Megillas Esther is indeed found in the Torah. It's one of the books of the Torah. It's one of the books of the Ksuvim, of the holy writings, found towards the end of the Torah. There are other Megillas as well, Megillas Esther, Megillas Rus, etc., which we read on different holidays. And it was one of the 5 Megillas, the Megillah of Esther. So you would think that the rabbis would have written something to celebrate that victory, and that's what happened. But that is not what happened. In fact, no book was written about it. It's only mentioned in another book called Megillas Tainus, which actually is not mainly about Hanukkah at all. Megillas Tainus is about the various fast days that the Jewish people must observe. We have various fast days throughout the year. Next week we're coming to the fast day of Asar B'Teves, the 10th day of Teves, which commemorates the beginning of the fall of the temple. So it talks about primarily fast days. Ta'anit means a fast day. Megillas Tainus means the books of the fast days. And in passing, Hanukkah is mentioned, and the miracle of the oil is mentioned there, as it is in the Talmud, which is again not a book of the Bible. The Talmud are latter writings, which are considered Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral tradition. So what is going on here? Why is it that today we mention the story of the oil, and the story of the oil is prominently mentioned, very much so, that's how it is observed, by taking oil and lighting oil each day for 8 days. As the name Hanukkah is, our rabbis tell us, an acrostic for Ches Nun Vav Chaf Hey. The Ches is for 8, the number 8. The Nun is for Neiros, candles. The Vav is and. The Chaf is like. The Hey is for Hillel. In other words, Ches Neiros, the Halacha ke beis Hillel. And 8 days, and the law is like Hillel. What does it mean? It means that there was a disagreement as far as the lighting of the menorah. Beis Shammai said, we light 8 candles the first night and decrease it each night. Hillel, his rival in learning, said it's the exact opposite. First we light 1 candle the first night, 2 candles the second night, 3 candles the third night, etc. So the name Hanukkah comes from the idea of the lighting of the menorah, the lighting of the candles. Hanukkah represents also the rededication of the Holy Temple, but in the context of the lighting of the candles, the rekindling of the Holy Menorah. It has nothing to say about the war, about any war at all. The rabbis explain why is Hanukkah 8 days. It really should be only 7 days, because they did have enough oil for 1 day. So the first day was not a miracle at all. Why did they kindle for 8 days? And the answer is that the first day was a miracle. What was the miracle? That they won the war. In that context, the war is mentioned. That they won the war. They rededicated the temple. And that itself was a tremendous miracle over great odds. I mentioned earlier that the town of Modin had a Jewish majority. And indeed, when the Jews started the war, they were the majority. But later, when Antiochus and the Greeks saw what was going on, they called for reinforcements, and they brought the might of the great Greek army and the Greek nation to bear on the Jews, and there they were overnumbered. But originally, in Modin, they weren't overnumbered at all. There was a majority of Jews there. So let's get back to the idea, why is Hanukkah today emphasizing the lights of the menorah, the miracle of the oil? Well, in olden days, it wasn't even mentioned. It wasn't even mentioned. Why is that? So the answer is that actually the light of the menorah, according to Rabbi Sachs, is much more important than the actual winning of the war. The winning of the war was a tremendous miracle against overwhelming odds. But the truth was that the war continued for about another 100 years after the story of Hanukkah took place. So they didn't really win the war at all. They merely they rededicated the temple. And that was a tremendous thing. But the war continued for another 100 years. And a lot of people don't know that. It would be today, for example, that after the Six-Day War, it was a tremendous miracle that they won this war in 6 days. And then they went on and they rededicated the Kotel, the wall, the western wall of the temple. And this was an incredible feat because we hadn't had the wall, we hadn't had the Temple Mount for 2,000 years. It was a tremendous feat, an incredible thing. But at the time, the Kotel was not the important thing. The war was the important thing. And to this day, some 50 years after the event, what do we talk about? We talk about the victory of the Six-Day War. And there are still movies written about it and books written about it, and they still study it in war colleges all over the world. The important thing was the war. But actually, what about the miracle of the Kotel? What about rededicating the Holy Western Wall after 2,000 years? Why don't we mention that as the primary focus of the miracle of the Six-Day War? Because the Six-Day War is still with us. The losses, there are many people today who have loved ones who were lost during this war. Indeed, it was very miraculous, but it's still with us today in many, many respects. So today we celebrate and we recognize the war, and we commemorate it on the anniversary of the success of the war, the Six-Day War. Not so much the Kotel, but primarily the war. Yom Yerushalayim, the day they conquered Yerushalayim and they dedicated the Kotel, is another day. That's another day. But the actual war today represents the major event of the time. And similarly it is with the story of Hanukkah. At the time, and perhaps for many years later, the miracle of the oil was considered very minor compared to the victory of the war. If you think about it, if you were there then, what would you consider the miraculous victory? They'd say, wow, look, we found some pure oil. Incredible. And it stays lit for 8 days. Very nice. But we won a war against overwhelming odds. What would be the greater victory? The greater event to commemorate would not be the oil, as miraculously as it was, but it would be the victory of the war. That would be the tremendous thing in those days. So Rabbi Sachs continues and says, well, why is it that today we hardly mention the war at all, except in our prayers? We mention it in the Al Hanisim prayer. We say during the Shemona Esrei and benching. We mention it in the Aneros Halalu prayer. We say after we light the candles. But if you speak to the average person in the street and ask them, what was the great miracle of Hanukkah? They'll say the oil. It was the miracle of the oil. Did you know that there was a tremendous victory, a military victory that took place also? No, I didn't know that. Yes, there was. So today, the important thing we commemorate is really the oil, which brings us around to the idea, why was the book of Maccabees not mentioned in the Torah? Why wasn't it included in the Torah? And the answer is because in the long run, it's not important. In the long run, the war and the victory of the war was not the important thing. The miracle of the oil was the important thing. That's why. When it came to the Megillah of Esther, so we know that the miracle of the victory of the miraculous victory of the Jewish people over the Persians and everything like that was a tremendous victory. But today, the real miracle, that we observe today is the miracle of the oil. How so? So a military victory is a military victory. In fact, as I mentioned, soon after the wars of the Greeks finished, the Greek Empire folded. No more Greek Empire. Now the Romans started to ascend. The Roman Empire became the great empire of civilization at that time, until its destruction by the Christians. So the story of Hanukkah actually represents, in many respects, the defeat not just of the Greeks against the Jews, but the Greeks against the world. That after the story of Hanukkah, there was no more Greek Empire. God caused the Greek Empire to fold and to be destroyed completely. So that is really the significance of the story of Hanukkah in terms of the world. So the world should observe the story of Hanukkah because it signified the end of the Greek Empire. But why is it that we observe the miracle of the oil as the great victory of Hanukkah for us? And the answer is because that is really what Judaism is all about. Judaism is a religion, a way of life, that originally we thought was only going to last for one day, for one era, but not for 8 days. It was not going to last forever. Like virtually every religion in the world, they had their heyday, they had their great times where they were successful and all-powerful, but then they descended and eventually they folded. And we take a look at empires all over the world from the beginning of history, from the Mesopotamian era, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Zoroastrianisms, the Romans, the ancient Egyptian empires. All of these empires were the greatest empires in the world, and they are not in existence anymore. You cannot point to them anymore. Some people felt that we should pay homage to the nation of Greece today, and we should sort of lower the observance of Hanukkah in Greece. In fact, Chabad has a center, several centers now in Greece, and they were wondering if they should make a big deal about Hanukkah because it celebrates the victory of the Jews against the Greeks. Not something really that you want to publicize if you're living in Greece. But the answer was that they should do it because the Greeks of the Greek country today, the country of Greece, are not the same Greeks as the old-time Greeks in the story of Hanukkah. The Greeks were very different. They were first of all, they were actually Macedonians. They were a type of Greek that was not the mainstay of Greece, and they were really Syrian Greeks. They were really aligned with Syria. The Seleucids, who were the Greek Syrians. So it was really a different type of Greeks, similar to the idea that today, the Egyptians today of Egypt, the modern country of Egypt, are not at all the Egyptians that lived during the times of Pharaoh. Completely different group. Who are they? Today's Egyptians are essentially Arabs. Ancient Egyptians were not Arabs. They were more closely aligned perhaps to the Europeans than to the Arab nations. Very different group. So, and so it is. Ancient Romans are not today's modern Italians. They're a very different group. They assimilated and they became a different nation. So the Greeks of olden days are quite different than today's Greeks. So the fact is that today we celebrate the miracle of the oil. And what does the miracle of the oil represent? And this is really the crux of the whole idea of what Hanukkah is really all about. Not a victory over a military victory at all, but a spiritual victory. Hanukkah, I think we mentioned some of this last week as well. Hanukkah is a victory of the Spirit, where miraculously The Jewish people survived practicing their religion with their Torah together. The ancient Egyptians don't exist anymore. The ancient Jews very much exist today. The ancient Egyptian religion is long gone, as are the Greek religion, with all the myths and the architecture, so much of it. And they were incredible architects. Take a look at the Pantheon in Athens. But they don't exist anymore. And the Greek great architects don't exist anymore. None of them exist anymore. They're not here anymore. But the Jewish religion, the Jewish way of life, very much exists today. Thousands of years after it started, some 3,000 years ago with Moses at Mount Sinai. And this is a tremendous thing, an unbelievable thing. A story is told that on Tisha B'Av one year, Napoleon Bonaparte was walking through the camp, and he saw a number of people who were crying. And he asked his generals, who are those people? Why are they crying? Are they angry that they lost the war against me? Perhaps they feel bad that I won and they lost? The general said, not at all. Actually, they're Jews. And today is the day that they observe the destruction of their holy temple. So Napoleon said, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Which temple was that? I haven't heard about any temple being destroyed. And they said, oh, it's the holy temple that existed 1,800 years ago. He said, they are mourning today for a temple that they lost 1,800 years ago? The general said, yes. Napoleon said, a nation like this will never be conquered. A nation like this will always continue because they have an incredible memory. And the Jewish people indeed have that unbelievable memory. We don't forget what happened in the past. And we keep our memory alive with us today as well as we have throughout history, with the Torah and with halacha and with the written Torah and with the oral Torah. All of these things to this day, Torah scholars study, and everyday Jews study the same Torah, the same words that Jews have always been studying for thousands of years. And the people of the Torah, we talk about today just like we did 2,000 years ago. We talk about Joseph and Abraham and Yitzchak and Yaakov. And we talk about Hillel and Shammai and Rav and Shmuel and all the great rabbis that existed, and Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer and all the rabbis of the Talmud. We discuss them, we talk about them. And we read what they wrote, and we study their writings, and we observe what they said we should observe. If they said we light one candle today, 2 candles tomorrow, 3 candles a day after, we do that to this day. After thousands of years, we still do that. And that's an incredible thing. The Jewish people are the great miracle of Hanukkah. The Jewish people are the candles that stay lit for 8 days or longer even. We are the miracle of Hanukkah. And that's why Hanukkah is such a great thing. It's such an important thing to observe. With all due respect, non-Jews are running around doing their shopping, putting up trees, singing beautiful songs, but it's a myth. None of these events that they talk about actually happened during this time for them. It was a pagan holiday. It had no historical values to them. If you talk to really religious traditional Christians, they'll tell you that their Messiah was not born on this day. Who knows where he was born, when he was born. But they acknowledge that it was really, and there are many Christians who don't even observe this holiday because it's really a myth. It is a holiday based on paganism. It was a great pagan holiday. It was the holiday of the god of Saturn. So it really has no historical significance to it. Unlike our holiday, Hanukkah is very much a significant holiday, which is factual, historical. It really happened. And the lessons of Hanukkah are very much alive today and observed today with us and with our children. We spin the dreidel, just like the ancient Maccabees spun their dreidel 2,000 years ago to hide from the Greeks. We eat latkes because of the oil, or jelly donuts because they're fried in oil. And of course, we light the menorah. Many people use olive oil, just as they used olive oil in olden days to light the ancient menorah in the Beis HaMikdash, in the Holy Temple. And these stories, these events, are as much alive for us and significant for us as they ever were before. So we Jews are literally living our own history. We are living a nation, a culture that has been in existence for thousands of years. I feel sorry for those people, those Jews who choose to abandon Judaism for whatever reason, to intermarry, to conquer another, to intermarry or to convert to another religion or things like that, because they don't realize the preciousness, the greatness of their own heritage, which is the Jewish heritage. It's an incredible thing. We don't need to reform it and conserve it or reconstruct it or do anything to it. It stands by itself, and it is holy and pure, and we light those candles today with the same purity of thought and action as we have been doing for thousands of years. This is an incredible event. It's an incredible miracle. And therefore, the event of the oil for us today is much more significant than the actual war that took place in olden days. And I suspect that probably in years from now, the Six-Day War will be put down in the history books as a very significant war. But I think that in years from now, what will be considered the great event of that war will be the rededication of the Holy Temple Mount, the Kotel, the old city of Jerusalem, that we conquered once again, Jerusalem, and we made it into our capital, as we found recently. The president declared Jerusalem as the capital of Israel for the entire world to acknowledge. And we thank President Trump for that tremendous event. And that will really become the major event that will be commemorated and celebrated. The event, the holy event, the miraculous event of the rededication of Jerusalem and of the Temple Mount. That'll be the important thing. So therefore, when we look at Hanukkah now, we see quite a different meaning to it. Now, many people think that Hanukkah is mostly just a holiday for children, but we see that it's not at all. Quite the contrary. Hanukkah is very much more for adults than children. It's a holiday which symbolizes the regeneration, the rededication of the Jewish people itself. And may God continue the dedication of the Jewish people forever and ever. And we hope that, God willing, that this will be the end of our gullus, the end of our exile, so that the ultimate temple, which will be dedicated, which will be the temple from God, which will be dedicated when Mashiach comes. May it happen speedily in our day.
Amen.